Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to introduce you again to Dr. Dayan Goodenowe, who is a neuroscientist and a inventor. He's a gentleman I've had the pleasure of interviewing before. Today, we're going to talk about a new center that he's opened up in Moose Jaw that is dealing with concussion, with autism, and numerous other things from a restorative health standpoint. He's got a big conference coming up this weekend. About a whole bunch of different issues associated with multiple sclerosis, ALS, etc. So we're going to talk about health and things that Dr. Goodenowe is researching that he can help us with. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Well, happy to be here, Brian. And it's been a couple of years, so things have happened since the last time we talked. So excited to be here.
Okay, well, great to have you. So let's start off with Moose Jaw. So what is this center in Moose Jaw? Why have you opened it in Moose Jaw of all places? And what does it do?
Well, Moose Jaw is my hometown. It's where I'm from. So we have Prodrome Sciences, which deals with early measurements of future disease and future health, right? Understanding the predictive nature of health and being able to understand biomarkers that tell us good things and bad things about the future. And that's all set up in Temecula, California. So we have our laboratory facilities in Temecula, manufacturing in Temecula, California. But my hometown is Moose Jaw. So what I wanted to do is bring back this technology into Canada because a lot of it was invented, or the precursors of these inventions were all done in Saskatoon. So I'm from Moose Jaw. So we set up a center. We have a restorative health center in Moose Jaw. So it's on 10 acres. It's got its own little lake. And people from all around the world come there with ALS, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis to get their health restored. So we deal with restorative neurology, restorative health. And the basic concept of our programs is that if we provide the human body with the appropriate materials, it will heal itself. It will fix itself. And so in terms of concussions and multiple sclerosis, if we provide the brain with the appropriate nutrition and stimulation, that the brain heals. And so we have wonderful examples of individuals. I got one woman, Lisa, who will be at the conference this week with multiple sclerosis. So she was originally had optic neuritis when she was 21, way back in 1992. Then she had her first relapse of multiple sclerosis in 2007, where she got numb all the way up to her chest and her arm, and fully diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Still had complete loss of vision in her right eye, so she's legally blind in her right eye. And then in about 2022, she started having drop foot and mobility issues, all classic systems, changes that happen with multiple sclerosis in the relapse and remitting phase. It takes many years for these things to happen. So we started working with her in 2023 by restoring her brain chemistry and biochemistry. And literally within 8 months or so, she started noticing that she could see words out of her blind eye. And so her vision was being restored after 30 years of blindness. And we do advanced MRI technology where we can look at the microstructure of the brain. And so we can actually watch as her brain heals itself and restore new neurological connections. And then, so her vision started coming back. A little later on, she started her drop foot. Like, she started being able to feel her foot again. So now, and her energy levels come back. So it's pretty amazing stuff where we're talking about how powerful the human body really is if you provide it with the appropriate nutrition. And so we have certain molecules called plasmalogens, which are essential for the brain. About 20-30% of the entire brain lipids are these plasmalogens. And the body makes all of them themselves. It's really important for early childhood development, say, children with leukodystrophies or autism type situations. But in multiple sclerosis, there's a big challenge with the white matter. So it's the myelination of the brain, this protective coating, like your brain and your neurological wiring is like copper wires with plastic coating, if you will. And the plastic coating that protects all these copper wires, which is your neurons or axons, is made up of plasmalogens. And the body was inflamed, especially with multiple sclerosis and other disorders, that myelination gets disrupted. And so we now have abilities to nutritionally provide biochemical precursors that enter the brain and allows the brain to actually continue and fix its myelination process. And of course, we work with other issues of the health, like mitochondrial function and things. And when we do that, we see quite amazing things. And so we do a lot of work in multiple sclerosis. So obviously, Saskatchewan and Canada itself is a hotspot for multiple sclerosis.
Why
And the
is
other,
Canada a hot spot for multiple sclerosis?
well, many theories. Part of it is the sunlight issue. So multiple sclerosis is associated with a higher latitudes, for example. So vitamin D association with multiple sclerosis has been kind of been around there for years and years and years. And it could be just a number of other environmental toxicity issues. It's hard to tell. No one really knows exactly for sure, but it's a fairly, robust observation that as you get higher latitudes, the incidence rates of multiple sclerosis increases.
Really, that's interesting.
Yeah. And then,
So,
of course, go ahead.
I had understood that part of the challenge with multiple sclerosis and concussion, if we get into that, which we should, was diagnosis of it, because it could be confused with numerous other things, and that there weren't really great diagnoses for multiple sclerosis. And for sure, concussion. I understand that the best diagnosis for a concussion is like a 10-point qualitative question.
Exactly.
There's no like MRI or something like that one can take to determine it. And then second of all, I had understood a couple of years ago that there was this big trend toward understanding multiple sclerosis as a lack of blood exiting the brain and iron buildups in the brain. And there was this thing called the Zamboni diagnosis that was to open up the veins leaving the brain such that you could empty iron out of the brain, and that was what was causing the death of white blood cells in the brain. So tell me a little bit about how you diagnose multiple sclerosis and concussion, and how you've come to the conclusion that it's these plasmalogens that are the problem rather than what other people think have been the problem. Because there's been lots of people trying to figure out what the problem is for multiple sclerosis, I think, and no one's figured it out until maybe you.
Yeah, well, actually, we do know a lot about multiple sclerosis. It's been studied for years and years and years. We have very, powerful animal models of multiple sclerosis. Magnetic resonant imaging (MRI), technically a T2 flare, which is measures white matter and looks for white matter hyperintensities. So typically, the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis involves symptomatic. Okay, people have the neurological symptoms. It could be reduced balance. It could be vision issues, like Lisa had drop foot. Can be bowel issues, those type of things. So basically, the loss of certain neurological control is always a symptomatic prerequisite of multiple sclerosis. And then you'll get an MRI, and early on, when the very initial neurological incident that a person will have is called the clinically isolated syndrome. And you don't really know if that's truly multiple sclerosis at this point in time, or did you just have some bad event, some acute bad event. And so this concept in multiple sclerosis is called dissemination in time and dissemination in space, if you will. So now, if you have this neurological event, right, which scares the bejeebies out of you, no one can help you, because they're going to say, "Well, come back later if it happens again." Right? This is the remission part of multiple sclerosis, and this remission part can go on for long periods of time. Like Lisa, for example, she was in remission for 15 years. The doctor told her in 1992 that she's going to get multiple sclerosis sometime in the future. Okay, so she lives with this fear of multiple sclerosis, knowing that it's going to happen sometime in the future, and she's kind of powerless to do anything about it. Then time goes on, and then you get a relapse, right? You get a second bout of neurological symptoms, and then the doctor neurologist will do another MRI, and they'll look for new spots, like new hyperintensities. And so this is the dissemination in space and the dissemination in time. And so when you have different white spots showing up on your MRI scan in different locations, that's the dissemination in space part. And when you have the relapse and remitting, where you have periods of neurological symptomology, and then you have periods of remission where you have no symptoms, and that cycle goes on for 20, 30 years. And eventually, as people get older, the disease progresses to what we call secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And at that stage, the remissions no longer are complete. You get some, your symptoms kind of go up and down, but you never get normal again.
So,
You
so
get
what causes this? Is it the
so
lack of plasminogens? Is it the lack of production of plasminogens? Is it this iron buildup that I was told about with
yeah.
the Zamboni treatment? Is it lack of blood? What causes it?
So what causes multiple sclerosis is microglial inflammation. It's inflammation of the brain. So there's an inflammation of the brain, and this inflammation attacks the white matter, this protective coating. So it's very clearly an inflammatory disease. And the major component of that is just mitochondrial function. So the energy generation of your cells. So in multiple sclerosis, women, mostly women, because it's 3 times more women get MS than men, and they will get this inflammation. So triggering events will happen where they get an inflammatory event and their brain isn't able to handle the inflammation. So it's very clearly an inflammatory component.
But isn't concussion, isn't traumatic brain injury also inflammatory events on the
Absolutely.
brain?
Absolutely. So they're both the same. The difference is that in concussion, you have this localized event, right? You got hit with a hockey puck or someone's elbow if you're a hockey player, or you fall down. So, for example, myself, I've suffered post-concussive syndrome from a head injury that happened when I was 8 years old. So when I was 8 years old, I was just in Moose Jaw. I was playing around in the basement and I slipped off a skateboard and fell on the back of my head. And of course, you're an 8-year-old kid, so your parents, I went to the hospital. I had, was there for a few days. Went home. Everything seemed normal, and I certainly felt normal because I lived my life. And when I started doing this research, I realized when I did my first MRI, I'm 56 now, did my first MRI because I was doing this longevity research and looking at, advanced brain imaging, assuming that I would be a control subject, right? Because I felt I was normal. My MRI showed that I had significant post-concussive syndrome, and we were able to restore that with these plasmalogens as well. So what happens in a concussion, or stroke? So concussions and stroke and multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis is kind of a generalized, like there's a generalized weakness and a generalized inflammation, and you can't really predict what will happen in MS. Like there's no predictability as to, hey, am I going to lose function in my foot or my arm or my vision? There's no way to predict exactly what symptomology will come. And in a concussion, what happens, obviously, you have some blunt force trauma that has happened against the head. And it's caused the head to basically, this brain, which is encased in your skull, will slosh with the concussion. And that sloshing basically can create what we call axonal shearing. Like because the brain is wired. People think of the brain like a computer, but it's not. It's like a wiring diagram. It's like the bulk, like it's like a pipe of wires that goes from your engine of your car to your taillights, for example. And so there are these big, long wire strands, and they're wrapped in myelin. And so you imagine taking a wiring harness, like from an automobile or whatever it is, and you just yank on it, right? And you know how it's connected at the end. So all the wires bear at the end, and they get connected to their fuse boxes or whatever it is. If you're a guy, you probably know what I'm talking about. But if you yank on the wires, what happens is you rip some of the connections of those wires, and that's what happens in a concussion, and that causes inflammation of the brain in these localized areas, depending upon where and when the concussion happened. And what happens with the brain is like a castle. It's kind of protected by your skull and by the blood-brain barrier, and that's a protective mechanism. But that protective mechanism also has a downside in that when you get damage to the brain has to fix it from the inside. Like there's really not a lot of outside help. You got to get into the brain to help the brain. So this blood circulation is a very big point. So when the brain is inflamed, circulation is disrupted in the brain. And so a lot of things for concussions and other things where you can improve the circulatory system of the brain is true. The iron situation that you bring up is really related to inflammation. So whenever you have inflammation, even in your periphery, like your rest of your body, like you get a cold or you get a flu, you're going to get iron buildup from the immune cells, because the immune cells, when they burst, They suck iron out of the cells. So there's iron associated with inflammation. But that's not the issue. That's kind of after the fact situation. Inflammation itself, and very specifically in the brain, microglial, activated microglia is the core component, which is very well documented in multiple sclerosis, and this white matter component of it. So what we do is the standard therapy treatments in multiple sclerosis and concussions and other things is just to suppress. So in multiple sclerosis, we try to suppress the immune reaction. The brain is in this autoimmune fighting itself constantly perspective, and they try to suppress the immune system, where what we focus on is restoring the intracellular health, which eliminates the actual immune response. Right? Your immune response is natural, normal. Inflammation is normal. Like, you can't heal from a cut or a wound without inflammation. Inflammation is how we heal from injury. Inflammation stimulates regrowth and a bunch of things, right? But it's only supposed to be around for short periods of time. Okay, and you have this temporary inflammation, which helps the healing process, and then that inflammation goes away. When it's chronic, if that inflammation doesn't help the healing process and it stays around for a long, long time, like say in arthritis or chronic inflammatory diseases, then your body has this constant load on it, and it creates a constant perpetual weakness, if you will. And that's what happens with multiple sclerosis. The inflammation never goes away. They get some event in their life from whatever may have happened, in their world. And then that inflammation kind of gets self-perpetuating, and it never goes away. So even a woman, when she's in the remission phase, if she's not having any symptoms, her brain still has inflammation. Her biomarkers and everything is still disturbed. We call that normal appearing white matter, technically, in science. But normal appearing white matter in multiple sclerosis is still not normal. And we can measure that with advanced MRI. And so I'm bringing that advanced MRI into Moose Jaw because we're going to have an MRI facility there. We have an inpatient facility. People from around the world come physically live with us for 3 months. We take care of their nutrition, physiotherapy, advanced blood testing. They have access to MRI from our facility in the United States right now, but in the future, the MRI will be within a few months. We'll have it there in Moose Jaw as well. And then we're also bringing manufacturing into Canada. So we're bringing our global manufacturing is going to be run in Moose Jaw as well for the plasmalogen supplements.
So these plasmalogens can actually be manufactured. Actually, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back with our guest, Dr. Dayan Goodenowe, in just 2 minutes. And we're going to ask about, can you actually manufacture these things that he says the brain is lacking in? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking with Dr. Dayan Goodenowe about brain health, I think it sounds like. Doctor, before we get into the manufacturing of plasmalogens, let me ask you a couple of questions, if I could. You talked about concussion, and you said that with concussion, you want activity. I thought with concussions, you wanted to be in a dark room for a couple of days, if not a week or so.
Well, there's 2 components. You want actual brain blood flow. So all studies that have showed that they've been able to increase blood flow to the area of injury, like using even transcranial magnetic stimulation or other types of tools, any kind of ways that you can increase blood flow to the area of the concussion improves outcomes, which is not activation. It's just basically because you want to clear the damage from the inflammation. So there's a clearance process. So that's very well documented that improves circulation, improves concussions. But while you're in a concussed state early on, the inflammation causes neuronal hyperactivity. Okay, so this is like an autistic child that is sensitive to sounds and lights and things like that. So your brain is sensitive because it's on fire, if you will, like it's being hypersensitized. The biggest problem with concussion, which is so scary, is that your brain is going to try to find a solution. And we give these athletes, so they have this initial period that you're talking about, these symptoms of the concussion, right? Brain fog, hypersensitivities, balance issues can be an issue. And then the brain looks like it's healing itself. Okay, their symptoms, they do a standard like calm, and they basically have bed rest for the first little while, or just really minimal exercise. And they ask the athlete to do slower levels of improvement, and then their physiological function comes back. And at some point, they get this return to play approval. The coach and the neurologist will say, "Okay, you're fine. You can go back and play football or hockey." And this is really quite tragic because the brain actually hasn't healed itself. And good advanced MRI technology has shown this very unambiguously, that the injury of the brain at the return to play designation is almost identical to what it was. And most of the injury from a stroke or from a concussion doesn't happen right away. The brain gets inflamed, and then this inflammation kind of builds. It's like a forest fire that slowly starts with a spark, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And so often it's 30 days or more after a concussion or a stroke that you see the real damage occurring in the human brain. Because it's the inflammation that gets it builds, and as it builds, it creates further damage. And then the brain starts to isolate that area that's been injured. Okay, it says, okay, here's an injured area. Can I kind of carve it out a little bit? Can I work around it? Right? Because you have a lot of extra capacity, and your brain has adaptability. It'll adapt to your injury. And this is why the problem is, so people get this return to play approval, and then they go out there, and what happens is that they're more susceptible to a second concussion. So an initial concussion makes you more at risk for a second concussion. So that by itself should tell anybody with two brain cells to rub together that clearly the concussion has not gone away, because you are weakened now, and you are now susceptible to a second concussion. The only reason you could be susceptible to a second concussion is if the first concussion hasn't been fully healed, and this goes on.
So you're saying that we're giving people return to play designations too quickly, too early.
Absolutely, and we look at these athletes like the prime human specimens of our world, right? Perfect, health. They watch their health, they exercise, but they don't age very well. Okay, so when these athletes get through their playing years, right, they suffer from a multitude of issues, psychiatric issues and neurological issues, and their lifespan is shortened versus the rest of the population. And so it clearly tells us that these head injuries are creating long-term problems. And we see this with children's care. This is a big issue. People, when you do good family history of an individual with, say, schizophrenia, bipolar, some later stage autisms, or even just anxieties and things, you'll see often that there is a previous head injury, and it could be 5-10 years in the past. Okay, especially when kids get injured in their early, 5 to 12 range. The brain is young, it's developing, it's got a lot of pliability, but then you fast forward to 18, 22 region, and then sometimes neurological symptoms show up many years after the fact. So this is something I'm very passionate about with the concussion space, and protecting the heads of our children in sports, and so now we're at the point where we can actually biochemically support the brain. So we can now restore, in concussions and in multiple sclerosis, even in Parkinson's, we're getting very good results in terms of improving health in people with Parkinson's. And so this is where it's really not that complicated. It's being able to actually provide building material.
Okay, before we get into the building materials and the solutions, let me ask you. So Parkinson's is similar to concussion. It's an inflammation of the brain.
Every single neurological disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS, MS, concussions, they all have an inflammatory component to it.
Of the brain.
Yeah.
Well, you also said stroke. Is a stroke?
Stroke, yeah.
But inflammation of the brain?
Correct, but they have different initiations. Clearly a concussion is initiated with a blunt flow, or blunt force to the head. The initiation of multiple sclerosis is slightly different. It's usually a generalized inflammatory syndrome, usually because the person has some mitochondrial insufficiency. Parkinson's is a disease that affects a certain cell type called dopamine cells, and these are dopamines in the substantia nigra, and it controls fine motor skills. And there's certain toxins in our environment that selectively target those dopamine cells. So people can get exposed to something. So that's an exposure that has targeted a certain part. But once it affects that part of the brain, these dopamine cells, that creates inflammation around the dopamine cells. And in Alzheimer's disease, it's the cholinergic system. Okay, nucleus basalis is the area, and so those areas get affected by whatever reason. And there's different reasons with great weakness. So there's different canaries in the coal mine, if you will, right?
And autism, you mentioned autism. Autism, has it got a brain inflammatory issue?
Oh yeah, this is extremely well documented. So all children with autism have inflamed brains. That's in
How? From a concussion or just from something else?
Well, multiple things. So autism affects 3 times more boys than girls. So you have the exact reversal of multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis is more prevalent in women, young women, okay? And then autism is more prevalent in boys. And the issue is when the early childhood brain is being developed. When you're born, you're basically born with raw wires in your head. Okay, so the brain, and so because you don't know how to use your hands, you don't know how to use your feet, you don't know what color red is, you don't know what a smile is, you don't know what a frown is. So a child needs to learn all these things, all these complex concepts. And the learning process is done by neurological connection. So when you're first born, you're born with this empty slate, if you will. But it's not really empty. What it is it's a bunch of raw wires. And as the brain learns things, it says, "Oh, here's a concept or path or something to learn." That neurological connection gets built and it gets myelinated. So when a baby is born, the last trimester of pregnancy is when the brain just begins the myelination process, which is this white matter process. And so when they're born, they're very, very deficient in myelin. So the first 3 years of life is when the brain develops all this white matter. And this is very susceptible to inflammation. So when a child gets an insult, so if they have any kind of, so we know things that are associated with increased rates. We have a lot of epidemiological data. Children that are born preterm have higher rates of autism. Children that are born underweight have a higher rate of autism. Children that are not breastfed, so especially exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months of life dramatically reduces the risk of autism. These are not cures. They're not going to say, you're not saying, oh, if I breastfed my baby, but I still have a child with autism, there's nothing wrong with you, that you didn't do anything wrong. Just that these are statistics. These are just showing, probabilities. But a child that is breastfed is 3 times less likely to have autism than a child that isn't.
There's a higher probability of autism if the sperm, the man, is far older?
Not likely. There's some issues there, depending these, male type diseases like X-linked, adrenal leukodystrophies. There's can be some genetic instability there, but mostly what happens is that you have more of a maternal component of it, mitochondrial. So the most common, genetic associations, if you will, with autism are related to the mitochondria, which is your energy cells. And we get all of our mitochondrial DNA from our moms. And so this mitochondrial DNA component, and then boys are just inherently weaker than girls during the developmental stages. Okay, girls have beta estradiol, which is a very powerful protectant of the brain. And there's studies been showing that the incidence of autism, even in boys, is related to, residual beta estradiol levels in their blood, for example. And so that kind of drives this gender bias in young children. And everyone knows that, the boy babies, when they're young, are always, less resilient than girl babies. And so then what happens is some sort of triggering event happens in their life. They get a fall, they get an adverse reaction, to something, or they get a bad flu. Something happens in their environment that triggers it. Okay, some random event. And then they're already kind of susceptible. And like the multiple sclerosis story that I just mentioned, it creates an inflammation of the brain.
So you're not born with autism. Autism develops because you've got this potentiality for it, but then something happens that develops it?
Correct. Yeah, no child is born with autism. Okay, period. Okay, so the rates of autism have changed, and it's so back in the 30s and 40s, we maybe had one child in 200, 300,000 that would have autism. And then in the 60s, 70s, it was like in the 1 in 50,000 range. And then it's been systematically going up over the years. And so you can't explain that genetically. So it's from a birth rate perspective. And so there are clearly genetic diseases, inborn errors of metabolism genes. And virtually all children that have some sort of metabolic genetic disorder will exhibit autism-like symptoms, because autism is basically a disruption in normal neurological development. And that disruption is normally caused by inflammation. Okay, so the inflammation of the child's brain impairs the normal development. It just creates stress. And so it's just basically trying to study in school with a bunch of loud noises around you. So your brain is trying to develop, but it's got a bunch of noise happening because it's inflamed. And it's delayed in its development, or it's disrupted because of the noise that the inflammation is causing. So yeah, so every study ever done, there's you can get into the details. I'm here in South Carolina at the Medical Academy of Pediatrics and Special Needs Children. So I'm presenting lectures on the neurology of autism. Was my lecture yesterday. And so, scientifically and in the medical community, this inflammation of the brain is ground zero in autism. So every practitioner that is targeted or that is specialized in the treatment of autism, every single one of them deals with brain inflammation.
So many of these different things that we've been talking about, whether it be autism or concussion or traumatic brain injury or stroke or multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, ALS, you say, are caused by inflammation of the brain, and plasminogens that you think you've got a way of manufacturing and providing to people can solve the problem. Is that correct?
Right. It's not really caused by inflammation. The inflammation exasperates it. The inflammation perpetuates it. The inflammation accelerates it. Okay. Like Parkinson's can be caused by toxins. There's a toxin like MPTP, paraquat, rotenone. There's certain environmental toxins that have been known to very clearly attack dopamine cells. So you can clearly say that's caused by a neurotoxin. Okay, so a neurotoxin can cause initial damage. Then that inflammation, that damage is inflamed. The inflammation then perpetuates and makes it worse, and it drives the progression rate. So the more inflamed the brain is, the faster the progression is in multiple sclerosis. The faster the progression is in Parkinson's. The faster the progression is.
Okay, so it's not caused by inflation, but it's exacerbated by inflation. And you think you've got the potential solution, or one potential solution for that inflammation. We're going to take a break for messages and come back, and I'm going to ask the doctor, okay, so how do I get these plasminogens? What are they? How are they manufactured? And how do I ingest them, consume them, inject them, whatever it is? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Dr. Goodenowe. He has been talking about inflammation of the brain and a whole bunch of different diseases or things that are caused by inflammation of the brain, and it ranges from a concussion to autism to Parkinson's to multiple sclerosis, stroke, etc. And he thinks that the solution to improving the brain and the inflammation that is caused in the brain is by having more plasminogens, which I think you said are naturally created by the body, but not enough, or we need more. And so tell me about that, what your solution is.
Yeah, so the inflamed brain is under a lot of stress, biochemical stress, okay, that the body needs. One of the core building blocks in the brain are these plasmalogens. And interestingly, they're only found typically in human breast milk. So one of the natural sources of plasmalogen precursors are in human breast milk, which is why it's associated with improved white matter development in children. And so we've now been able to manufacture molecules that are the identical molecules that are in human breast milk. These are called plasmalogen precursors. And it's important because there's lots of plasmalogens in your body, but your body makes them all. Like your heart, for example, 50% of the lipids in your heart are plasmalogens. And So the plasmalogens are very critical to the human body, not just the brain, but the heart, the lungs, kidneys, eye, for example. But your body makes them all from scratch. And the very last step in their manufacture creates this called a vinyl ether bond, which gives it its flexibility. It's in the membranes of your body. Unfortunately, that bond doesn't survive digestion. So if we have a whole bunch of plasmalogens in our body, we're saying, well, if I'm eating a nice steak or chicken, why am I not getting plasmalogens from my diet? Why can't I get this from my diet? Which is a logical question. The problem is that the final plasmalogen isn't biologically available. It gets digested by the stomach acids. So plasmalogen precursors are one step before that. And that's actually what's in human breast milk. Breast milk contains plasmalogen precursors, which is why it's associated with that. So we've been able to manufacture these plasmalogen precursors, which are nutritions. They're food. They're dietary supplements. They're like a protein or fat. These are fats, and so they're designed basically like fish oil or olive oil, if you will, except it has a plasmalogen backbone. And then it gets digested, it gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and it goes into the cells of the body, and it goes into the brain. And it provides ready-made material for the cells in the brain. Okay, the cells can then take up this precursor, and then they can rebuild the myelin with it. And it's not the only thing we use, of course. It's part of overall nutrition, mitochondrial support, like your proper vitamins, creatine for muscles and brain energy, phosphatidylcholine that maybe people talk about. So science and the nutritional space have been very diligent over the years, and there's a lot of good strategies, okay, that are helpful for individuals. The plasmalogen precursors add one more critical component to an overall brain nutrition protocol. And so when we look at restoring brain health, but from the inside out, if you will, it's about restoring the core materials the brain needs to use. So rather than trying to play God, rather than trying to come in and say, we're smarter than the human body, and we're going to block this receptor, or we're going to create this drug, we basically say, look, if we just provide the brain with what it wants, it will actually naturally find its own solution to the problem. And that's the kind of the approach that we have. So it's called brain health, as you mentioned, Brian. It's focusing on, and we use advanced blood testing to measure biochemical markers of health to ensure, we have good tests that tell whether the mitochondria are working, your plasmalogen levels are healthy, your phosphatidylcholine levels are healthy. Then we have advanced brain imaging now that can measure the brain in excruciatingly fine detail. We have the ability to fully digitize the human brain, both in its structure and its function. And I train doctors. Okay, I have about 3,000 doctors in my network that use these technologies and tools. We have about 50 what we call elites that actually have access to these advanced tools of MRI, some advanced nutrition tools, and these advanced blood testing, this ion cyclotron testing that we use. So that's the kind of stuff that I do. And then I go to conference like this and others to try to educate and try to bring a lot of this research level technology. I think most people would be shocked to understand is how much good research has been done. Okay, a lot of people want to, discount some of it. The issue isn't our scientific vigor. The issue is implementation of that knowledge. That's where the breakdown is how do we implement the knowledge that all these scientists have done? And I've contributed, my background is in the academic science world, okay, large epidemiology studies, working with universities around the world. And we do all this research, but then we publish these papers about these findings. And it was always someone else's job to actually bring it to the public, right? And that's usually the pharmaceutical industry's job or the food industry's job, right? And there's a big gap between the knowledge that we have and the implementation of that knowledge. So back in 2016, I really focused my career on bringing advanced technologies to everyday doctors, people that are actually treating patients, they're on the ground, they aren't taught this type of advanced nutrition in school. A doctor is taught how to diagnose, and that's not a bad thing. People should realize that, 2,000 years of medical research is based upon diagnosis. Normally, people don't go to a doctor until they're sick, right? and they go, "Hey, doctor, I'm not feeling very well. What's wrong with me?" And the doctor's job is to diagnose you, right? Find out, and certainly find anything that's going to be acutely dangerous to you. Like, what's going to kill you in the next 24 hours or so. And we're very good at acute care. Okay. And that's how the history of medicine has been developed, is on symptoms. And then we've started to ask the medical community to get into this longevity or restorative health or chronic care. And the system is really not designed for that. That's where public health should be more involved in terms of understanding community health, because health is not the absence of disease, which is what we've kind of been dealt with. And I think there's so many doctors out there that are treating their patients, and they're very interested in understanding, how do I treat people before they're sick? How do I restore health? How do
So
I
I've
maintain?
said on numerous occasions we have sick care, not health care.
Exactly right. And it's important not to play the blame game in this. It's asking an industry to do what it's not designed to do.
Okay, so your solution is these plasmalogens. How do you manufacture them, and how do you get them in someone's body?
Well, they're oral. They're simple oral. We have a liquid formulation, and it's also in gel caps. So we make them in our laboratory. They're all made from scratch. They're all vegan. We have two types. One is omega-9, which is oleic acid. That's designed for the white matter, that the myelination that we talked about for multiple sclerosis and autism. And another one is an omega-3 called DHA. And that's for synaptic function, neuromuscular function, reverse cholesterol transport. So the trick is, basically, we make the plasmalogen backbone, which doesn't exist, in food supply. It exists in a human body. It exists in human breast milk, for example. So it is in the food supply, but Brian, you and I don't get a lot of breast milk anymore, so we can't really get much of that. And so that backbone is clearly in nature, and then we take the fatty acid, which is either the DHA or the oleic acid, and we put it on the plasmalogen backbone.
So
And then now that's orally bioavailable. So it's a simple nutrition. It's oil. You can mix it with your food, or you can take it as a capsule.
and is this a pharmaceutical product that needs an FDA approval, or is it a nutritional product that needs a GMP approval, or what's the approval process?
Yeah, our manufacturing is all full CGMP for sure. The approval process it's a natural supplement, so it doesn't need FDA approval. There actually is no FDA path. It's not that the FDA doesn't treat. There is no FDA path for natural supplements. You can't take a steak through the FDA, for example. And so
So omega-3 fatty acids have gotten FDA approval for, like, which I think are just fish oil, aren't they?
So omega-3s are FDA approved for certain indications. So FDA approval is for the treatment of symptomology. Okay, so you can't get FDA approval for the treatment of health. So FDA is designed to, if I want to say for Parkinson's, if I want to develop a drug that reduces L-dopa-induced dyskinesias, so I have to have some symptoms. I have to say, okay, this person has abnormal movements, and I can quantify the abnormal movements in that individual. And then I develop a drug. Say this drug, or supplement even if you want to, for that perspective, or some product that's going to directly affect that symptom. Then I run a clinical trial to show that the symptoms change with my product. That's the FDA approval process. There is no FDA approval process for health.
But you could get it for a specific symptom, is what you're saying.
Correct.
Potentially.
But,
okay. So how could I get a plasmalogen?
In the United States, it would be called a medical food, actually.
Right. Okay. Can I buy this at the local nutritional store? Or do I buy it online? How do I get one?
You buy it online. We manufacture in the United States, and it's shippable. We ship all around the world from there.
And you're going to start manufacturing in Canada, because I want to buy Canadian.
Exactly. Well, that's why I'm setting up our whole international manufacturing and distribution is coming out of Moose Jaw. So we bought the facility a few months ago. It's being tooled right now. The equipment and everything else is being installed. So I'm hoping by the end of the year we have full manufacturing in Canada. But right now we manufacture in the United States. And
if the plasmalogens are available through human breast milk, why aren't they available through milk I can buy from a dairy?
because it's not in cow's milk. And so this has been studied from.
Why, if it's in the human breast, why wouldn't it be in the breast of other mammals?
Very good question. It might be related to the neurological developmental path, but I don't really know the answer to that. I don't know anyone knows the answer to that. It just happens to be every time they've done these studies showing that there's high levels in human breast milk and virtually like 1% in cow's milk. So it's just I don't know, freak of nature, I guess. We have unfortunately, we don't have an answer for everything, Brian.
Sounds like breastfeeding is one of the best things one can do then.
It really is. But remember, it's statistics, right? So it doesn't mean that and also how the health of the woman during pregnancy also matters, right? And so we now have a number of pregnant women and breastfeeding women that take plasmalogens while they're breastfeeding, and it really improves their children's sleep and gut function, for example. So you can obviously, by supporting the health of the mom, supports the health of the child, which makes obvious sense.
Makes sense. Dr. Goodenowe, this is absolutely fascinating. If I want to get more information about you, about your restorative health center in Moose Jaw, plasmalogens, and how I can get them, where do I go?
So best place to go is at drgoodenowe.com, so drgoodenowe.com, and check out the conference coming up this week. It's really going to be eye-opening. We are bringing together actual patients. Okay, people will, like Lisa will be there. Ananth with ALS will be there. Nicole and Madeline will talk about their children with rare diseases, and we bring actual people, so people get real life experience. We bring the doctors, these highly trained doctors that work in this field together, and then in science, we bring these three pillars together for communications. And 3 days, probably have over 1,000 people, online and at the conference. So please log in and join us and understand that this is not science fiction. This is really simple, straightforward, obvious stuff. And the supplements themselves are at prodrome.com. So prodrome.com is where you would find if you want to buy any of these supplements directly. And if you are interested in the Restorative Health Center in Moose Jaw, where we bring in clients from around the world, all that information is at drgoodenowe.com. There's lots of educational.
Dr. Goodenowe, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. This has been very interesting and very educational.
Thank you, Ryan.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from the United States, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Doctor.